My name's Simon Roberts. I'm a British photographer based in Brighton. And for the last 15 years, my work has been predominantly based around looking at people in the landscape. So I've been interested in looking and thinking about how we interact with the landscape, how we use the landscape, and how in some ways we commodify the landscape. So it's not just this static backdrop, it's something that we manage, we change, we adapt. And it also tells us something about our own identity, both in terms of a kind of national identity, where it's often harnessed to be used to create a kind of sense of a place, but also on a more kind of micro level in terms of, regional and even local identity. I think about the landscape in terms of both, in terms of leisure, politics and society. Well, I suppose I almost use the analogy of peeling away at the surface. When you first look at a picture, it just has the kind of surface. But then actually when you look at it longer and when you try and read the landscape and read what's going on inside the landscape, it reveals other details. It reveals small narratives. It tells you something about how we're living now, but also tells something about the past, whether that's in terms of geology or whether it's in terms of how the kind of land has changed its usage. It might have gone from a place of work to a place of leisure, for instance. And so often I kind of want to look at the landscape and think about how can I show the viewer this sense of time passing. And also the challenge is not just looking at something that is extraordinary, but actually turning the lens onto something that is, in one sense, quite banal, quite ordinary, but actually looking at it in a way that makes it extraordinary, just in terms of what's going on in that particular place. So it could just be a game of golf, or it could just be a picnic, but there's something in that photograph when you look closely that elevates it beyond just this idea of the banality. So the idea of looking at landscape really came out of a year that I spent photographing in Russia. And that was back in 2004, 2005. And I was particularly fascinated in Russia how there was a real kind of sense of belonging. There was this sense, a palpable sense of how Russians think about their own identity, and this sense of belonging to a place, belonging to this notion of the mother Russia. And I felt quite distant to ideas of my own identity as an Englishman or a British person. So when I returned from Russia, I spent the next year working on a project where I traveled around my own kind of nation, trying to understand a bit more about how do I sit within this notion of Englishness. Throughout kind of contemporary English history, but at least since the Romantic period, there's been a very strong connection to ideas of what the landscape means. That idea of the green and pleasant land, how we go out into the landscape. This is something I wanted to explore with my pictures. At this point, I began photographing from an elevated perspective. So I would find a platform, mostly from the roof of my vehicle, where I could overlook the landscape. So I wasn't part of it, I was at a distance to it. There was a kind of removal, and by having the elevation, what you're doing is you're lifting the middle section of the landscape. So it doesn't just become about the foreground and the horizon. You have this rich seam across the middle where you can see people using that space. You can see how they're interacting with one another, how they're interacting with the place itself. So there's an element of kind of both geography and sociology. So when I began the work in Normandy, I decided that I would concentrate on leisure because I was interested in the way that leisure is the one thing that we choose to do. We don't necessarily choose the job that we do. We work to then spend the money that we earn on our leisure time. So what we do in our leisure time, I think, has a much greater reflection of how we think about our own kind of identity. How do we associate with others? Is it through politics, and is it through a sports team, or is it through what kind of activity we do at the weekend? And so I really wanted that to be part of the central part of the work, but also thinking about festivals and the kind of history, thinking about, how do we connect to places? What are the elements that give us a real rich notion of our own part of a place? So one image I did have in my head when I was making this work was, of course, the Impressionists and the fact that they were drawn to this particular landscape. You know, painters like Monet and Boudin, but also photographers like Gustave Le Gray. So I did look at this kind of imagery and this representation, and you know, I suppose there are connections to that. You know, thinking about using a particular light, using, you know, embracing the kind of meteorology, you know, using the atmosphere, like, you know, the clouds or the mist rising. So you create a certain type of feeling in the picture that maybe represents the past, but at the same time, it's very much about making a contemporary image. The original work was made between 2014 and 2016. And so it's interesting coming back now 7 years later to make some new work in the region of Cotentin. And so it's interesting looking back at the pictures and how we kind of take for granted in this post-COVID, or we're still in it, this kind of COVID era, where for this long period of time, we were no longer able to meet in large numbers or even relatively small numbers, you know. And so looking at these pictures, which are about gatherings, are about where people come together, to be often quite close together, it's quite strange now, trying to make new work here in this region of Lower Normandy, in this time where many of us are really longing to kind of get back to some kind of connection with friends and groups of people.